Welcome everyone. My name is Egil Østenstad. I've been given the honor to host this evening with these two guys. I'm not quite sure how to do that, but I've been told that these guys pretty much run their own business. So I guess I'm just going to stay in the middle and see what happens. I lived most of my life in sports, in football. Playing football in Viking and playing football in England. I've also been lucky enough to work with football after I finished playing. For the last 3 years I've been doing something different, which has been nice as well. Together with me on my left hand side here I've got Thomas Peeters, who is from Erasmus School of Economics. He's an assistant professor. And amongst other things, he's teaching in sports economics. And on my right-hand side, I have Peter Antonioni, who is connected with UCL School of Management. And amongst a lot of other things, he has performed the research on football transfer market. Peter is a big fan, Thomas is a big fan of Antwerpen. And Peter are happy these days because he is a big Tottenham supporter. So it's good days for him.
Finally.
I'm gonna start by telling a story from my career in England when I played for Southampton. This was in the spring of *97, I think, and every day when we came to training at Southampton in the dressing room. The kit manager used to put out a lot of papers. I have to say it wasn't The Guardian or anything like that. There was different kind of papers, but there were sports in the papers. And I remember one day when we came in, there was an article about the captain of Man United, the crazy guy Roy Keane. And it said Roy Keane has signed a new contract with Man United, and he's going to earn £10,000 per week. And we were sitting in that dressing room and the guys went, fucking hell, that's ridiculous. How can that be possible? And it was like unheard of. And we thought we were earning good money at that time, and we were. And then Roy Keane, 10 grand a week. And it was just within a year or so, 10 grand was nothing. So how is this possible, and how long can this be sustainable? Peter?
Possible. Right, to begin with, so when you're talking about, wages, what everybody tries to do is they try to get up to the wage of people that they aspire to being like. So, Roy Keane asks for 10,000. You start asking for more money until 10,000 becomes normal, by which time Roy Keane, of course, wants to differentiate himself from you, so he's asking for 20. So over the next period, you try to slowly catch up, by which time he's asking for 50, and so on. That's pretty much how top wages tend to go up during a bubble, and I just want to say, footballers get a lot of stick. I'm going to have a bit of sympathy for the devil here. The entire executive remuneration market works in the same way. So board-level salaries have been set in a similar kind of way, which is why they've been rising so much faster than normal people's incomes over the last 30 years, actually. 30, 40 years nearly, in fact, if you go back. So you have that. Sustainability. I don't see any signs of there being any crunch in the immediate future. I do see that it kind of probably levels off in about 5 years as you just reach the maximum of that you can bring in through, either TV revenues, which have been one of the big things supporting it, or the patience of whatever oligarch is trying to support the club. So as far as there being a short-run crunch, no, not in the next couple of years.
Well, I would agree to that. The thing with football is, and that's pretty much, I guess, not that much in the press, is that it's an industry with a lot of small firms. It's not big business. So it's your average Norwegian club or your average Belgian club makes about 5 to 10 million euros probably, which is about as much as your local store that sells groceries in the street. So there's a bit of a misconception here. Most football clubs in Europe are rather small, and even the large ones. I know Manchester United is currently the largest revenue club. Any ideas what they make? Well, 680 million euros. That sounds like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that much. And for example, my university, Erasmus University Rotterdam, nobody probably has heard of this place, but it would be the 5th largest European football club in revenues if it were a football club. And its brand is basically worthless in comparison. So it would be larger than Bayern Munich, for example, which is crazy. In terms of branding, obviously, Bayern Munich is much, much more important than my university. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is there's no industry that has grown for 25 years, 10% year on year, every year, like football. And so in the sense is this, your story is just, you were on the inside of this boom, and you saw it from the inside out, what this means. If an industry grows like that, eventually football clubs have very little things to spend money on except for players. They have a stadium, okay, they can invest a little bit, but preferably they let the town do that. And all the other things that they have are basically very small costs. So when they get more money, they have only one thing to spend it on really, and that is on players. And Roy Keane was on the beneficiary end of this trend. And as long as revenues keep growing, like Peter is saying, there's no real reason why the boom is going to bust. And like you said, there might be a leveling off, but I don't know why all of a sudden we don't want to see football anymore on TV, which is essentially we're all paying these wages, right? So as long as we keep paying for our football subscriptions, we'll see those pays being paid.
What will happen to football? With the things we are seeing happening in the last couple of years, with new countries, new leagues coming up. Suddenly there are clubs in China buying players from the Premier League, and what's going to happen then with our willingness to pay money to watch TV if suddenly all the best players ends up playing in China? Are we following the players, or are we watching the clubs?
Well, I've got to say, China's already been ahead of the game on this one, and they've already clamped down on signing foreign players. So what's going on in China is probably a more interesting story, and probably a wider consideration about the Chinese economy. Other leagues flowing up, well, the media rights are still available. We might be paying for the rights to watch those ones, rather than, we have a romantic view of the past when people pitched up to watch their local club, and most people are actually watching on a screen now.
That's true. I mean, and if you look at competition towards, what the Premier League has been very successful in is basically going to places where football was small and establishing itself in those markets before the local league sort of could have been making big money. If you look, for example, at the US, by far still the largest potential market for any sport, there's a US league, it's called the Major League Soccer, nobody cares. And that is, even Americans don't really care, and that's because the Premier League has been so successful in establishing itself as the prime league to watch in America, that actually the Premier League TV deal in America is worth more than the Americans League American TV deal in America. So the Premier League is so successful in conquering these markets that basically I think China and the US wake up a little bit late in this game, and they've been, they've been driven in the corner. Basically, they can be the next Belgian league, but that's not a position anybody wants, I guess. So,
well, you could have been the Norwegian league. But in a way, does these big leagues and these big clubs potentially will they kill the local leagues, kill the local clubs? We have a slight problem in Stavanger at the moment with Viking, and financially, is these big leagues also a factor that will make the smaller leagues, the smaller countries, the local clubs even smaller?
Well, being from a small... is it okay if I answer this one?
No, of course,
okay,
yeah.
Okay.
I'll tell you what,
just
you take
interrupt me when
you take the
when
country's side of it, I'll take the local club side of it.
Okay, that's... So, when I watch the Belgian league, I would say it's not killing it, it's already dead, right? So it's not... it's not like we are really competing with these guys. I mean, the last time we were anywhere near a Champions League final was Anderlecht in 1989 or something. So there is no way that you can claim that we are on a level playing field with these leagues. And I would say the reason, as Peter has said, is these TV rights. And as long as we keep, serving a market of 10 million Belgians, 5 million Norwegians, I'm going to say, is that, I don't want to... 6 million, I'm really not so sure, but that is not a match for a Premier League which sells worldwide. Not to say that even Germany, for example, is a market of 80 million people just by itself. So you cannot be on a level playing field with those countries. Speaking from a small country, the only hope you have is that, by chance there's this brilliant Belgian player that decides for some reason to stay in Belgium until he's 21 before he sells himself to the Premier League, right? So that is the one upshot that we sometimes have. But other than that, I would say they are pulling away. And your question is, are they killing it? Well, probably it's, in terms of competing with them, it's already, that ship has sailed. And what is true is that the smaller leagues are not necessarily decreasing in size. So in absolute terms, Belgian players, Norwegian players and Dutch players now make more than they did in 1995. But unfortunately, English players are now making 10 times more and Belgian players just the double of what they were making in 1995. And that's how, because all of this is of course a relative game. It doesn't matter if back in your day, in the Premier League, if you would come with those wages today, it would be ridiculous, right? So it all matters in relative terms. So even if in absolute terms the football industry is growing in a small country, it matters very little.
So yeah, if I take the one on local clubs, actually this very interesting case in this is England, because it has far more fully professional clubs per unit of population than anyone else. And of course what happens is everyone has two clubs. They have a local club, which is the one they actually get to go up and see and cheer at the games, and they have the one they support in the Premiership, where they, more likely are watching on TV. And actually, if you look at the rate of bankruptcies, the peak rate of bankruptcies in England was actually in the 1980s, when clubs were getting higher attendances than it is now. And, even when you take a notorious basket case like Leyton Orient, who ended 108 continuous years of being a member of the Football League last year, the only factor you can point to that really explains it is the fact that they were taken over by absolutely demented owners who ran the club into the ground. So if you assume the quality of ownership is about average, then actually the local clubs are doing better than they might have been doing 30 years ago, despite the growth of the big clubs.
Yeah, so the picture is everybody's growing, but because some of them are just growing so much faster, they're running away, and that is what everybody points to as being unfair, or that's what we think is a problem. At least Norwegians and Belgians probably are more ready to say this is a problem than Manchester United fans, I guess. But
I don't know if the Manchester United fans would, say anything about it. So I suppose the case that you'd cite in England is that Leicester City 2 years ago were, the first really outsider champions that we'd had since, I don't know, Aston Villa in 1981 or Derby in 1970. And that's actually, well, okay, over that longer period of time, at least one outsider club is going to win it. But there was a period beforehand when the competition in the top 2 divisions was very, very much more equal. And almost no club had a repeated title between, I think, 1930 and 1970. So there is an argument about equality of competition that goes in there that sometimes gets mixed in with it, and it's good to keep them a little separate.
It's also the big clubs and the financial strength in the big clubs also a threat to the national teams as we know them, and even the World Cup and the Euros.
Probably not. When you talk about the World Cup, there's a long and interminable qualifying period full of a lot of low-quality games, followed by 4 or 5 intense weeks where everybody suddenly gets very interested. So in those 4 or 5 weeks, when you take the special events, people are going to be paying the attention, and that's still going to be valuable. What's more, I think, more usually kind of what I suppose people would argue is that the Champions League is now the pinnacle of world quality rather than the World Cup. So,
yeah. So I think you're right. I mean, I don't think a lot of teams will have a problem releasing their players to go to the World Cup as such, because obviously when your players do well there, that is actually the number one, that is like the fair of football, right? That is where transfers are being made. Sometimes clubs will see their players, double in value because they scored one amazing goal in the World Cup. What is not the case is that these, like you say, the qualifying games, clubs see those, I think, as just injury machines where they send players and they get them back damaged. And often these are low quality games, nobody really cares. So what I can see happening is that the big clubs, which are very powerful, that they would push with UEFA in sort of making it more into a sort of a more stratified system, which is, I guess, what they're trying to do right now, where the top countries would, play each other more and do not have to bother with, going to win 10-0 at the Faroe Islands or at Andorra in order to qualify for, and then probably break an ankle on a bad pitch. So I can see the big clubs pushing for that, but I think equally the players actually would be in concert with the club trying to do something about that.
With all these super rich people of the world wanting to own a football club and the willingness for to pay more and more for the rights to show football on TV, what's the effect on other sports than football? We only been talking about football now. What's going to happen to?
I can talk about one here, which is that anybody know what Britain's second biggest sport is? Cricket? No. Which one?
Are there more than one?
League is. Rugby league is Britain's second biggest sport by attendance. Do you know how many clubs in the top 2 divisions of rugby league made a profit last year? 1. Catalan Dragons. Absolutely everybody else is being bailed out by central money. There has been some very big consequences of the attention entirely going towards football. And one of them is that actually at the club level there's just no money in other sports. So if it weren't for centrally funded contracts, cricket and rugby union would probably be entirely bankrupt. And rugby league has this really weird geographical position where it can't do very much to centrally fund. So it's always hanging by a thread. So, for example, the team that was second biggest over the 1990 to 2005 was Bradford Bulls. They're now playing 2 divisions down, having gone bankrupt twice. So, you know, there has been some very, very big consequence of this. And, you know, you can't actually sell TV subscriptions, particularly, on a portfolio of events that does not include football. Another one that's really, really interesting is there's a lot of big push for women's football at the moment, and, you know, it's good. But one of the things that's really interesting is that when I was a kid, the England-Scotland women's hockey match used to be played at Wembley or Hampden Park. There would be 100,000 people there watching it. The idea that you can get that audience now, even with England Great Britain having the hockey gold, no way would people turn in. And that has been consequential. Do agree on that?
Yeah, I think you're right to some extent, and I think one of the big effects of this is that football pays a lot of high wages, and that is for a good reason, because football has seen a lot of revenue growth. But I think a lot of other sports now, you know, want to be more professional or have more economic clout than they actually have. So, because, you know, in Belgium, for example, I recently, the volleyball men were complaining that they were making X times less than the Red Devil football team. Well, that is true, of course, but that is because, you know, revenues in volleyball are basically non-existent. So the idea that everybody now should be allowed or should be a professional if they play in the first division futsal or volleyball, or that is basically an effect, I think, from the growth of football, which makes it, you know, thought of as being normal that you do a sport for a living and not for fun, whereas most of these sports do not attract the kind of crowd or the kind of TV rights, usually not any TV rights whatsoever. So basically you have to ask yourself, is it realistic that when 1,000 people come and watch and they pay 10 euros per person every 2 weeks for about 20 times in volleyball, do we really think that we can maintain a squad of 20 professional players that make a decent living? The answer is obviously no. So why would that be even come up into your mind that it should be that way? Well, that's because football players are obviously driving their Ferrari around town while you are, you know, sitting there busting your ass trying to make a volleyball career. So I can see that sort of effect there, but that's not really football's fault, I would say. But it's true, that nonetheless.
It's interesting what you said about ladies in football in England, because that's a big debate in Norway as well at the moment. How to rise football for girls and ladies, and if it is possible. And when I lived in England, it was on TV. It was no problem on Match of the Day or on Sky to joke about women playing football, and there were no reactions to that. And
Andy Gray paid to that one, didn't he?
Well, at some stage it was like women's football was something they were laughing about. I was lucky enough a year ago to be at the new centre of English football, St. George Park, and it was fascinating to walk in there, and you saw that ladies football were profiled exactly the same way as men's football. So you had these big pictures of the women's team of England next to the big pictures of the men's team, and also in the Premier League now there's talk about regulations that will force the clubs to have a ladies team. Can regulations sort of lift other sides of football, or even other parts of sports, with all the money going towards football and not other ways?
I think there's an element of be careful what you wish for about this one, actually. I mean, okay, one thing about women's football in Britain is that it's now professional on and off the pitch. When you were saying, you know, at the time when you were saying women's football was laughable, it's actually not that the quality of the players themselves was that bad. It's that it was the organisation of the whole thing was amateur from top to bottom, and using the pejorative sense of amateur. Really, you know, there wasn't very much professionalism about it whatsoever. So I think there's a good side to it, which is increasing the professionalisation. As we had the problem though with other sports, again, there is a limited amount of attention that people have, and you're competing for that amount of attention. And at the moment, the big beast in the jungle is just quite simply not just men's football, but the top division of men's football, and probably not even that, probably just the top 6 teams there. So there's always going to be some element of it. As far as making clubs have a women's team as well, I think it's a horrible idea. Actually, you know, why should we care whether Burnley has a women's team or whether Charlton's women's team, you know, Charlton being a 3rd division club now, is actually a 1st division women's side? You know, I mean, why do you necessarily have to have them located in that area if somebody is just doing it better? So I just don't see how that even that values the players, or it doesn't really value the clubs particularly, and it just seems like an almost absurd way to push the organisation on. However, the FA is good at absurd reorganisation. So,
well, I would say, well, what I would say to that is, I think it's right that there would be role models for girls that want to play football as well. And I do think that the football associations can do things to promote women's football. Like you, I'm a bit afraid of putting, I mean, we're economists, so we're going to say regulation, you know, watch out. That's what we do. But one of the things that I think is exactly right is, if you think, I mean, probably men's football is not the business model that women's football should aspire to be. And that is, I mean, in even men's football is probably, many people would say, that is not the business model men's football should be aspired to be, right? Aren't we all, you know, longing back for the good old days when money in football wasn't that important? Now what we're saying to the women is, what you should do is you should make money much more important than football. Isn't that a bit strange that we, on the one hand, long for the days when the men's game was not as monetized, and on the other hand, think that the women's game should be more monetized? So, I don't know, and like I was saying about volleyball, think about what is a sustainable business model for women's football. It's probably not the Premier League men's football model, which people would probably argue is not even a sustainable model for men's football. So I'm not sure that we want to copy too much of that through. I'm all for, you know, there being a inter-country women's football, and I think they should appropriately cover people's costs and you know, pay them for their services. But there's probably not a way in which this can grow to the size of the men's game. And so I think you should probably take that as a presumption when thinking about how this industry should look like before, you know, copying things that the men do. I mean, the best example I think of where this all goes wrong sometimes is that now every sport in Europe wants to have its own Champions League. Now that's not a winning proposition for most, because the Champions League works because TV rights make it work. So people pay for the Champions League to see it on TV, and you get a large amount of money, and you can distribute it to everybody that participates. If you do this for a small sport, what happens is you make everybody buy expensive plane tickets to come to a venue where nobody comes to see it, and there's no TV cameras there. Everybody loses money. So please don't play your local teams, right? That is much more of an economic sensible way of doing things. And so I'm always a bit afraid when people look at football and think, oh, it's because of the things they do that they're successful. That's not necessarily the case.
And arguably, I mean, even if you look at what's been happening in Britain, women's football has grown massively, to the extent that you're probably on the verge of being able to sustain at least, you know, 1 division or 2 divisions of full-time professional competition. And at that point, you shouldn't be trying to force it beyond the revenues you can get. You should be trying to slowly and determinedly develop your market so that you actually start to bring in more revenues. Really, in that sense, you should just treat the system, you know, the women's football system as an entity in and of itself, and not try and compare it with something that's already run away. So if you do it through a much more sustainable, organic way of doing it, you probably end up with a better long-term outcome, and probably more people would be happy with it. Trying to force the issue and just right now might be, I was going to say challenging, but really, I want to use a stronger word. Probably just barking mad.
Barcelona, a club that most of us love to watch, and we love the story about Barcelona more than a club, and owned by the people of Catalonia. But it's not the same with every club in football these days. We have a lot of different owners, and a lot of owners with a lot of money that we're not quite sure where the money is coming from all the time. Do we care? Does the Chelsea supporters care about?
Oh, Chelsea supporters don't care. Chelsea supporters are never going to ask where Roman Abramovich made his first million. I guarantee it. Look, it's not necessarily the case that a club like Barcelona has a moral superiority. Barcelona, you have an election, and like every politician, the guy who wants to be the director of Barcelona, the president of Barcelona, promises to spend a lot of money. And usually the incentive is always to promise to spend the money, irrespective of whether you're going to recoup it in revenues one way or another. That's not necessarily a good model to have. Germany, we've got the 50+1, except the, is it Wolfsburg,
and Bayer Leverkusen,
and Red Bull. Red Bull got around it in one way or another. So, it's not perfect there either.
Well, a bit of the misconception, I think, about football is that people tend to think that in some countries it is profitable and in others it is not, but it's really not profitable anywhere. So it's not like there's this crazy southern countries and then there's the well thought of rational northerns who do things much better. It's basically true that football has never made a lot of money, probably never made any money. On average, we have been gathering the accounting data from 1973 and now 1952 up until today. And basically what you see is even when players took the train with the fans to go to the away games in 1973, clubs were paying a couple of £1,000 and the clubs were losing money, then and now. And so the idea is, why are they losing money? Because suppose that you are a club and you make a lot of money. Try it, give it a shot, try and make a lot of money and then go bargain, go to the fans and say, guys, you should be so happy because we made a big profit this year. We ended 10th in the league, but guess what? We made a lot of profit. That is not a way in which you remain the president of a football club, right? So if you want to, either you have these owners who spend a lot of money of their own money, and we can discuss, like you said, about where that money is coming from, or you have the system where you choose your president, or you have the fans owning part of the club and so on. All of these models, there's not one of them that you can point to and that you can say, this one is the one that's turning a profit. None of them do. What is true is that, like what the English model is, namely that a club is something that you can buy and someone can own it completely, that obviously opens the door for that particular person's personal preferences to be very important. And if that person happens to be an American investor who has on his mind that, the Glazers at Manchester United would be the typical example, they are looking to make money out of Manchester United, and that can be done. The problem is if that person is Abramovich, well, if it's a problem we can discuss, but then he has another objective in mind. And I agree that the Chelsea fans probably don't care. And should we care? Well, I would say it's probably a problem that Abramovich got his money if he got it through illegal activities. But is that the problem of football, or is that the problem of Russia, which allows people to get money through illegal activities? And so is the case of, I can see why we don't like, Qataris buying clubs. I can see, people, is that still an English club and so on and so forth. But How did these people get money? Well, because we bought their oil. Is there something illegal about it? No, we gave them, I mean, they made their money square and fair in the oil, you guys should sympathize with this, right? So there is nothing inherently wrong with this model versus, I mean, we talked about Arsenal. They basically have an American owner whose business is to go to a city and, you know, extort some money from the council for a stadium, then go to the next city. So is that a better owner? He makes profits, that's true, but is that morally better than what Abramovich did? I don't know. I think you should not try and solve the problems that football didn't create in football, and the problems that Abramovich has been, you know, I'm not going to say anything on camera because we're being filmed here, about where he did not get his money, but clearly it's not, I mean, it's not football's fault that people make money illegally and then invest it in football. And that's probably, you're going to say, a bit easy, but if for some reason the UK has no problem with Abramovich living in London as a free man, spending his fortunes there, why should Chelsea make a problem out of that? And not, you know, he probably buys a lot of Harrods too. Is Harrods is that wrong that they deliver luxury items to his house? I don't know. Probably, you know, that's the same thing. So I'm not sure that we're now we're coming off as the big market economists, of course, but I'm not sure that we need to make a problem out of that.
Yeah, same view. I'll tell you one thing though is that actually against this, one problem that economics has. So I'm kind of reaching here, but economics has a difficulty in assigning value to soft things. So, for example, soft power or cultural impact. I mean, and this is actually a bit tricky because at various times in history they've been very important. So, for example, who won the Cold War? Everyone says America. No, America didn't win the Cold War. Elvis won the Cold War. Levi's jeans won the Cold War. Coca-Cola won the Cold War. These were, and this was actually not about its pure economic power, but about what they had symbolically. So I've got a bit of sympathy, shall I say. You know, it's not that I completely buy this argument. It's that I've got some sympathy with people who bemoan that a cultural asset isn't held by a group of people. I find that I'm stretching now to just say, well, actually, this is now an argument for, and it's not really an argument for anything. It's more an observation, to be honest.
I'm very skeptical in this point, and that is because what my fear is always is what governments should absolutely not do, not townships, nobody should put money in football. I mean, there is enough money in football. So what is always a bit creepy to me is I'm very hesitant to say this is a cultural thing and the city of Manchester or a group of Manchester people should have a say in this. Because basically, are we really thinking that it's better that the local Manchester working class people burn their money on Manchester City? Let the Qataris do that for us, right? There's no, I mean, why should we?
I did say I was stretching.
Yeah. So I'm always a bit hesitant to go with this because I'm very afraid that, you know, I've been in Antwerp and I've witnessed, you know, every time the club has been irresponsible for 5-10 years, they basically go belly up and everybody looks at the council and says, shouldn't you guys buy them out? And the answer is clearly no. I mean, the last thing you should do is to buy, I mean, this is not like a bank which is gonna, you know, disrupt the entire economy. This is like your local supermarket going bust. Are we saying, oh, this supermarket here, the local store is going bust, we should get council money and buy them out? No, of course not. Because there is some social value in football, and I recognize that, but in order, that opens that door too much, I think. And I'm really all for keeping that door firmly shut. And let private capital be invested in football, but not good old taxpayer money, because that's...
Shouldn't talk about that in Stavanger these days.
Did I make myself unpopular in the room?
No,
not
I'm pretty
necessarily.
much with you. I mean, like I said, I've got some sympathy with the argument. I find I'm stretching to fully believe it for exactly the reasons you say.
You're coming from a country that obviously is maybe the biggest football country in the world, and have a religious way of thinking about what happened in 1966.
The ball was over the line.
Sorry,
I'm required to do that.
And it's fair to say nothing really happened after that with your national team. And you're coming from a country that has.
Yeah, we don't even have these disputes because we were never there anyway. So.
No, but your country has had remarkable results, or at least very good results with your national team from a very small country and a small footballing nation, after investing a lot of money in youth development over the last 10
and sending
years.
a lot of players to the Dutch too.
Yeah, so you created a lot of good young players who's gone out and made a lot of money, playing for the big clubs, coming back, doing well for the national team. England now, at the moment, are probably Belgium when it comes to youth development. For the first time, the young national teams has won the World Cups, 3 World Cups in a year.
It's amazing how big the impact of one man can be with the national team now. Have you noticed that 50% of the debutants from the last 3-4 years, they were all trained by Pochettino?
Who's one of the best managers in the world. But what's the point for England to invest all this money in youth development when the players have to go and play in Belgium? Because of the Premier League, and all the Belgians all the players from Belgium are coming to the Premier League.
The talent market is more international than it once was. And the thing is that England players don't, by and large, play in other countries. And this has been a point that a lot of people have made, that national success might be hindered by players playing over abroad. And England is the classic counterexample. All of the England teams been playing in England for a long time, and they're still shit. So you still have this. As far as the lower age group ones. This was, I think, England finally getting its act together after a long, long period of general disorganisation. I mean, we're talking 20, 30 years of disorganisation, to be honest. And once the Gerrard Lampard's generation all started to reach the end of their careers, there was nobody coming up afterwards. But the thing is, you've got to think about it like this. So you invest in 100 players coming up, you get 50 become professionals. Assuming you've already pre-sorted these are the best 100, and then you've got 50 become professionals, and then 25 of them play in the top division, and then 10 of them become internationals. There's a bit of a numbers game about it, and there's a bit of a once you actually getting through all of the nets and becoming a top quality international is a game of attrition. So, even with England's success at the under 20 and under 19 levels, it's no guarantee that it's going to transfer into success for the national team, the top line national team, one way or the other.
Well, I think what in England is always a discussion is that your players don't get chances and so on in the Premier League, and that hinders them in their development.
I do think that there's been a risk aversion that has done that, but I'd like to see the data that really shows it, because it's not so.
Well, my counter argument is still that there's no country having more players in the English Premier League than England, right?
That's true.
And you need 20, right, for the national team. So there's 20. I mean, and they play at the very highest level. Any country would kill for 20 players that play in the Premier League to field in the national team, except for Germany, perhaps. But
the counter argument then is that actually the Premier League isn't really the relevant thing. It would be the Champions League, And when you look at it, you know, Chelsea have got 2.
No, that's true.
Cahill and I think another one. Is there another English guy in the Chelsea team? Who? Well, okay, so maybe 2. Arsenal, well, you know, Arsenal produced Theo Walcott.
Well, you're going to say Tottenham now, don't you?
Like I said, I think that the dependence on the Mauricio Pochettino production line is interesting. But I mean, you know, you look at, I mean, but Tottenham have only been in it, you know, a couple of years. They were bouncing around on the edges of it, you know, doing trips to Karabag on Thursday nights. So, you know, it's not really that. So if you look at the other ones of the perennial Big Four, not that many English players amongst them.
No, that's true. That's true.
Getting towards the end here, but what about agents in football and the money going out of football via agents? Does football need agents, or is that one of the stakeholders in football that you could just take out and football will be exactly the same tomorrow?
I don't know if football needs agents, but I guess most players need agents, and that's a bit of the crux here. I mean, I don't want to be judgmental here, but many players come into this industry very, very young and very, very low educated on financial stuff, and then how to negotiate contracts and how to legally make contracts, and that is where the agent comes in. And as long as we have these players in demanding agent services, that is where the agents can come in and basically earn the rents that you described. Like, they do take out a lot of money out of the system, but that is because clubs and players let them do that. I mean, clubs could give their players better guidance and could teach them how to negotiate contracts, but that would mean probably being, you know, more, how do you say that? Well, taking more responsibility for the welfare of their players than some of them probably do now. And if clubs complain about agents all the time, they still agree to these transfer agreements which say that the agents get 10%. They put signatures underneath these documents. So I'm a bit skeptical when clubs come and complain about this. I follow the argument, but one big counter argument is, well, clean up your own shop, right? Why don't the clubs take action? Why should somebody else take action?
Other interesting side of this is the professionalisation of sports agency as a business. And, you know, even 20 years ago in Europe, you know, there were 1 or 2 super agents and not really a big infrastructure behind them. And now it's become a branch of a wider sports management industry. So in some ways, actually, the professionalisation should actually be helping both the players and the clubs to some extent. I mean, you know, don't forget that clubs use agents as well. You know, they've got players that perhaps their face doesn't fit, perhaps they have 2 left feet, you know, perhaps they're drinkers or something, and they use agents to shift them on as well.
And I mean, I follow, so I'm not saying that agents don't, I mean, they take out money that is probably, they take it out for a service, and especially if you think about cases where agents go and fetch people from South America and, you know, make them all these kinds of promises, and then they don't come, or they do come true, that is a bit, I think that is a problem. But in order to tackle that, I think you need to rethink the whole transfer system and how we allow that 14-year-old kids are bought in South America, shipped to Barcelona, and then, you know, be in La Masia. We know Messi who made it, but we don't know the other 100 kids that did that trip and never made it out, right? So I think there's something to be said about that whole industry and about that whole system, and the agents are part of that, but it's not just the agents. It's also, is it really the kind of thing that we want, that parents are dislocated from that children at 14 taken from their school in Norway and they go live in Manchester where they know nobody, and then they go to school 2 hours a day, and the rest of the time they're playing football, and in the end they have a bad knee and they don't make it. Is that the kind of thing that we want for children of 14 years old? I would probably say, well, no. But that is something that the clubs do as well as the agents. So I'm not willing to give them all of the blame, but some of the blame for sure.
Is there anyone having any questions to Thomas and Peter? Come on, we're starting over here. Because it's not fair, is it?
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of research on financial fair play and define fair, right? That's the crux of the matter here. Fair in financial, well, I talked to the economists that made these rules, and basically they wanted to call it something like the financial control rules or something like that, very unfancy name. And Platini basically came to one of their meetings and said, this name needs to change, make it financial fair play. And that sounded a lot better, and the marketing people loved it too. But what is really fair about it, I mean, the basic rule that everybody talks about is this break-even rule. And what it says is you can't spend more on football-related outlays or player wages and transfers than you get in from football-related sources, and that's media rights, tickets to your stadium, and your selling of jerseys and stuff like that. It is not what your owner puts in the club. That is outside of that, and it's not what the township or the government gives you. That's also outside. Okay, so balancing these two things, who has a problem with that? Well, Chelsea did have a problem with that, Manchester City, Paris Saint-Germain, and so on. So what is the big effect, if any, is that these clubs should go back and spend less on players, allowing the old big revenue clubs like Manchester United and Real Madrid to more easily outspend these clubs. What will that do? Well, as an economist, I would say it protects the old firm big clubs from the competition of these new guys that come in with some money that they got from an investor or whatever. Is that fair? Well, you could say yes, because these clubs have big revenues for a reason. You could also say no, because what it would do is, a city like Paris, which is arguably the largest city and the richest city in Europe with just one team, why shouldn't they have a top team? So if I want to invest in a club in Paris, why should I not be allowed to do that? And so financial fair play is fair in the sense that you compete on your own money, but it's unfair in the sense that it's, protects these big old clubs from competition of the smaller clubs. What will it do on all the levels below that? Well, I guess not that much, because if you allow for what is in the rules as well is that you can make up to 30 million losses a year, and your owner can make an investment as long as you have a plan to break even in the end. So for a club like Viking, I guess 30 million euros, you can do to be able to do quite a bit with that, right?
Would be helpful.
So, and at this level of the Norwegian and the Belgian league, financial fair play doesn't play a big role. And of course, you only have to comply if you want to participate in the Champions League or the Europa League. So I guess for most teams in Europe, it's basically a non-starter anyway. So is that fair? I would probably say it's not more fair than what we see right now. Will it work? Given what Paris Saint-Germain has done over the summer, they've pretty much shown everybody where the big holes are in this whole system. So, and it looks a bit like a Swiss cheese right now. So it's not like the loopholes have been exposed, and Paris Saint-Germain was first to do it. But I've been talking to quite a few people and quite a few lawyers as well. And what they've done with the transfer of Neymar, I don't know. Do we have time for that? It's pretty neat. It's pretty neat. So
I don't have anything to add to this, so just please.
How does a transfer work? After Bosman, which was supposed to end transfers, what needs to happen is you have a playing contract, and at the end of that contract, before Bosman, you could still be transferred. Right now, that's illegal. So what happens is A club gives a player a contract, and then when the contract is about to end, they give him a new contract so that the player keeps being under contract. Now, in this contract, they usually write, at least for the top players, they write a sum of money that the player needs to pay in order to get out of his contract. So basically, it's as if you and your employer would agree that you cannot leave unless you pay him 200 million euros. Now, most of us would not sign this kind of deal, right? But in case of footballers, they get quite a lot of money for signing, so they do. Now, suppose that you are Paris Saint-Germain in Barcelona. What usually happens is, you know that Neymar is not going to pay 200 million out of his own money to buy himself free. So what usually happens is that the two clubs come together and they agree on a lower amount, and that is the transfer fee. Now, the beauty, if you want, of the Neymar loophole is, what happens here is, there's nothing illegal about Neymar buying himself free with money that he got from a friend. Now, who happens to be this friend? It's the Qatari Tourist Authority, who happens to be a good friend of Paris Saint-Germain's owner. Now, isn't that beautiful? He basically goes to Qatar, somebody gives him 200 million euros, flies back to Barcelona and says to Barcelona, hey, I want to buy myself free, at which Barcelona looks at the contract and says, well, legally you can. So let's do it. And Neymar basically then went to the La Liga offices, and there was this, they didn't accept the check at first, and there was this whole media circus. But it's beautiful because Paris Saint-Germain did not spend $1 or €1 on getting Neymar to Paris. So basically, they got him for free as far as financial fair play is concerned. Now, UEFA is going to try and find a way to say that the Qatari Tourist Authority is really the owner of Paris Saint-Germain, and that would make it illegal again. But right now, they're looking very hard, but it's not because it's your nephew or your best friend. I mean, best friends can give gifts to one another, right? It's nothing illegal about that. So it's a beautiful thing in the sense that if you're a lawyer, I mean, this is like, I guess, this is the nec plus ultra of finding loopholes, but it's the end of financial fair play as we know it, I guess. So, anyway.
Next question.
Yeah, the smaller clubs that get foreign investors to come in and buy the team. A lot of these look to be very short-sighted. 90% of them fail. They go down in the league system, like the example you said. So what is the interest of having these very short-term plans to have success instead of having a team that succeeds over a long period? I think another example is the Ginetta in Scottish football. The fans really believe that they're going to compete in Scottish top division.
You want to take this one?
Yeah. There's an odd thing about when you said foreign owners, because actually we have 120 years of information about owners of football clubs, full stop, in England, and this has been the norm even before there were any foreign owners. A local businessman would pitch up at the club, would promise big things, be there outside with his jag and his sheepskin coat and his big cigar, and he'd be like, yeah, we're going to be champions in 3 years, and he'd be scarpering in two. This is actually something that's not new and has been going on since the Victorian era, and everybody falls for it every time. I've no idea why. But it's actually a long-term thing. As far as the clubs go, I mean, there's a thing that you're thinking about the club as a legal entity, and there's also thinking about the club as a governance structure, which has a board which makes that type of decision. So it's not usually the fans who do it. And generally the board, if it sounds like a good deal, you know, the board will announce it and say they're really happy about this. The new buyer will announce it and say they're really happy about this. And for a while, people will be happy. And then there'll be that, you know, wet Wednesday night where they lose to Stoke City or something like that. And that's when they'll turn. But, I mean, you're not really describing anything that hasn't gone on. Actually, not even in football, in all sports industries since they came into existence.
That's true, and the interesting thing about the foreign owners is that I would argue even that on average they're a bit smarter than the former, because they buy the teams that could potentially make it. I mean, if you look at Chelsea or Manchester City, you might say, or Paris Saint-Germain, they are not stupid buys, because Chelsea is potentially in a large market, right? And so if you're foreign, at least you don't have probably that sort of local hard feeling for your local club, which makes you think that Gretna can be a powerhouse in Scottish football, or Antwerp. Well, so the big thing is I'm waiting for my foreign owner in Antwerp, because we are in the largest market in Belgium, and we're shit. But the thing is, if you look at what these foreign owners do, it's not so stupid usually, in the sense that there is an economic logic to thinking that Paris Saint-Germain can be a big club, where there is often, like you were saying, there's no economic logic whatsoever to thinking that your local British UK town that currently is in the 3rd division will be champions in 5 years. But the local builder or the local pub owner thinks that way, and that's actually been, the long run of British history, British football history, north and south of the border. Mm-hmm.
One more question, and then we have to stop.
Is with the corruption and use of drugs in the sports is about the Olympics and cycling, football, maybe not football, but is it just a big circus, a big show where we don't, a lot of bad things in all levels or all sports?
The drugs and sport thing is, there's an interesting side to this, which is that there's an evolving arms race between people who are providing performance. Actually, I'm going to have to say performance enhancements rather than drugs, because it's getting much more precise than this, because it's also, coming soon, genetics, right? So actual gene therapy for sports people. Now, one of the things that football that keeps it reasonably clean is that the average footballer runs, 10 to 12 kilometres a game, right? That's not as much as some other sports, and strength isn't as important as, say, American football or the really drugged up sport, professional wrestling. So you've got some things that keep football, that keep there being a little bit less of an incentive. But actually, this is really the way to look at this, is kind of an evolving arms race between the people who are providing the treatments and the people who are trying to clamp down on it. And it's going to get a tougher job, is really the best I can say on this. It's going to be a very, very tough job soon. I mean, already advances in medicine as far as, things like individualized diet and nutrition gets very close to performance enhancement in some ways as well. We've got the role of genetics. We're going to have potentially nanobiotechnological things that are going to be almost impossible to detect. So, I mean, as far as does it make you feel jaded with sports, I don't know. I mean, I thought there were many things that could make me feel jaded, but even so, still, every Saturday I still want to be watching Spurs. So,
We have to leave it there, Peter. So Thomas, I'm not giving you a chance to comment on this.
Okay.
So
I'm a big cycling fan, so I'm all for doping. So that's.
So that's the conclusion. And tonight, Peter and Thomas, thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming.